Hey, Katie. We have the clue of the tapping heels. We are on Chapter 2, Animal Uproar. Nancy sat tense, her mind in a quandary. Should she investigate the basement at once? I'd better not go alone, Nancy thought. She was tempted to awaken Mrs. Beeling to accompany her, but decided against disturbing her. Nancy had noticed that the tapping sounds were uneven. It occurred to her that possibly they were a code. She could not translate any of the tapping sounds into words, but on a hunch she stood up, crossed to a bare spot on the floor, and in Morse code tapped out, "Who are you?" There was no answer. Nancy waited 2 minutes before moving. There was not a sound from the basement. Had the tapper left? Nancy dashed from window to window and looked to see if anyone were hurrying from Miss Carter's. Nobody was in sight. That tapper must be in the house still, she concluded. Although certain that the door from the kitchen to the basement was locked, Nancy went to make doubly sure. The bolt was in place. She returned to her listening post and sat in a chair for another hour. There was no recurrence of the tapping, so finally Nancy decided to go to bed. Tomorrow morning Bess and George and I can investigate the basement thoroughly. She was just dozing off when a shriek from outdoors awakened her. Nancy rushed to the window of her room, which was in the back of the house. All the lights in the garage were on, and she could hear excited voices. Wondering what had happened, Nancy grabbed her robe and slippers and hurried into the hall. By this time, the disturbance had startled a couple of dogs in the neighborhood to barking. The din had awakened both Miss Carter and Mrs. Beeling. The nurse rushed into the hall, demanding to know what was going on. "I don't know," Nancy said as she dashed past the woman and down the back stairs. Mrs. Beeling followed her. When Nancy opened the outside kitchen door, she saw a man running across the backyard of the house next door. It was too dark to distinguish his features, but he seemed to be rather short and stocky. Nancy raced after him. By the time she reached the neighbor's driveway onto which he had turned, he was out of sight. The young sleuth went all the way to the street, but saw no one. Not a car was parked, nor was one leaving the area. Nancy turned back. I wonder if he could have been the mysterious tapper at Miss Carter's, she thought. I wish I'd had a better look at him. When Nancy reached the garage, Bess and George were telling Mrs. Beeling what had happened. I didn't dream it, Bess was saying excitedly. That side door to the garage was locked, but I heard it squeak, and when I looked that way, it was being pushed open. George took up the story. I was asleep, but when Bess shrieked, I woke up and turned on the light. I saw the door opening, but slowly it closed and the lock snapped shut. How had the intruder managed to open it? Had he jimmied the lock? Nancy wondered. A quick glance revealed it had not been tampered with. She concluded the stranger must have used a skeleton key. A skeleton key is a key that can open like any lock. It's kind of a key for anything. Did you see anyone? Nancy asked. Bess and George shook their heads, and George said, There was such a commotion among the cats, we didn't have a chance to hunt for whoever tried to get in here. I think maybe I saw him, Nancy told her, and explained. Since I lost track of him so soon, he must have scooted around some other houses and disappeared. The animal uproar continued. 2 dogs came bounding into the Carter yard and yelped at the cats in the wire enclosure. The Persians in turn arched their backs and hissed at the tormentors. Get out of here! George shouted at the dogs. One of them slunk away, but the other became defiant. He clawed at the wire cage, and when George rushed outside and tried to yank him away by his collar, he turned and would have sunk his teeth into her arm if she had not pulled away in time. Meanwhile, Nancy had found the garden hose. She turned it on and aimed the stream of water at the angry dog. For a few seconds he caught the water in his mouth as if playing with it, then gave up the fight and ran off. The excited cats refused to settle down. Some had scooted up the sides of the enclosure and were clinging to it. Others had dashed into the garage and hidden under any available object. Mrs. Beeling was wringing her hands. "I don't think we'll ever get these animals quieted down," she said. "Perhaps I should bring Miss Carter out here." "That's a good idea," Bess agreed. "I'll help you." As soon as Miss Carter arrived, she began to call each person by name. "Don't be so naughty, Abatha," she said to one. The ball of fluff clinging to the top of the cage disengaged itself and climbed toward her. "Come down here, Rosamond," she told another, and it obeyed instantly. The girls were amused by the names and amazed that the woman had such good control over the cats. "She just loves them," Bess whispered to Nancy. "I should think she'd hate to sell any of her darlings." At that moment they heard a shout from the house next door. A second-floor window was raised, and a man stuck his head out. "What are you trying to do?" he thundered. "Miss Carter, don't you know people around here want to sleep? I'm not going to put up with those cats of yours any longer. I've stood them for 6 months." "I'm dreadfully sorry about what happened," Miss Carter called to him. "It wasn't the cat's fault. Someone tried to break into the garage and that upset them." "What's that got to do with the dogs?" the man shouted. "I'm sure it won't happen again, Mr. Bunce," Miss Carter assured him. "That's a lot of talk," the man exclaimed. "You're not going to get away with this. I told you before to get rid of the cats." Miss Carter looked worried. She said to Nancy, "This is the first disturbance we've had." The conversation, which was too low for Mr. Bunce to hear, seemed to anger the man. "What are you conniving now?" he cried angrily. So conniving is like they're coming up with some sort of plan, or they're plotting. Whatever it is, it won't do you any good." Bess stared at the man in disgust. "What a creep he is," she whispered. Mr. Bunce continued his tirade. "I'll tell you, Miss Carter, what I'm going to do. Inform the authorities these cats are a nuisance and a menace, and I'll see to it that you get rid of them at once." He slammed the window shut. Miss Carter had turned ash white. In a tremulous voice she said, "I love my cats, and selling them brings me a nice livelihood which I need. Mr. Bunce will ruin my business." Another thought occurred to Nancy. If Miss Carter should decide to move away, the mystery of the stolen cats and the tapper might never be solved. She was determined to clear up both mysteries. This could not happen. We'll have to find out what happens.